Dr. Zoe Hope Bulaitis is a social professor of liberal arts and natural sciences at the University of Birmingham. Zoe is an interdisciplinary scholar and educator. She works across liberal arts, creative and cultural studies, and humanities policy making. She teaches also literature. Zoe is the editor-in-chief of a journal, Public Humanities, that Marek already showed us, and the author of a monograph, Value and the Humanities, the Neoliberal University and Our Victorian Inheritance from 2020. The book explores strategies for value articulation in the humanities in public life. It's an open access book, so you can read it for free on the internet. Zoe's work reaches out of academia, and she cooperates with local policymakers to shape new ways of thinking about the role of the humanities, for instance, in city planning, local industry strategies, and inclusive growth. She has claimed, as Marek already mentioned, that public humanities happens whenever humanities scholarship interacts with public life, and today she's going to open and explain us the typology that was on the screen some moments ago, and tell us also why the humanities still matter and how to articulate the value of the humanities in the 21st century. So this is a perfect start for our winter school. And now, if she's there, please join me in welcoming Dr. Zoe Hope Bulaitis. Okay, now we can see you. Good.
Amazing, brilliant. Thank you so much. And I would really like to start just by extending my sincere thanks to Marek, to Daniele, to other colleagues in the Estonian Doctoral School for the Arts and Humanities for the kind invitation to speak to you all at this year's winter school. I'm so grateful to Eva for expertly coordinating my participation in this event. A special thank you also to the wonderful technology team, particularly Carl Youssef and Trine, and everyone working behind the scenes to make this school both a practical and an intellectual success. So I'm hopeful also that there'll be a set of slides that are going to be shared alongside my presentation. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. So this school, I think, comes at a perfect time for the field of the public humanities as we set to explore new ways to engage with society, but also to consolidate a growing set of practices. I think that the lineup of speakers over the next few days promises to be absolutely fascinating, and I am more than a little bit envious that I won't be there in person with you all. Whilst I would have very much liked to be with you in Tallinn, the timing of this event coincides with a particularly heavy teaching commitment during the semester, which has rendered international travel very difficult. I send my apologies for not being there physically with you all. It is so generous, though, of the organisers to have made it possible for me to connect with you this way, and I'm really keen to continue the conversation beyond this presentation. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me by email with any questions or ideas or feedback after this in the next few days, indeed also in the next few months and years. Okay, so my talk today has two main sections. First of all, I'm going to speak on what is public humanities as a field, and secondly, what is public humanities as a journal? So in a way, I'm answering that question, what is public humanities, in two different ways. I think it's a question that you, no doubt, will also respond to differently and in different ways. The definitions are completely up for debate here, and I don't want this to be a kind of fixed authority. This is a starting point that I hope we will develop and expand together. So, what is public humanities? This is the definition we've heard introduced a few times, which is exciting to hear the kind of take-up of this. But public humanities happens whenever humanities scholarship interacts with public life. It's worth emphasising, I think, that the most basic form is interpretive thought and conversation about human creativity and culture. But in terms of mapping out the field, we've we found that there's, oh, my slides are just skipping through there. Apologies. Seems to be jumping 2 at a time. Perfect. Thank you. So this is a typology that we've mapped out here. We've seen it in the introduction. And I think what's really worth emphasizing here is that this typology of the public humanities includes at least 10 kinds. But I want to emphasize there the at least. This is not intended, again, to be a comprehensive list, but a starting point. It's certainly capacious in its definition intentionally, but it's a means to kind of understand this emerging field in better ways. So I think over the next few days, I hope we can expand and interrogate where we see these elements of public humanities, and I will indeed in this keynote today be speaking through that myself. I think another element in this kind of definitional work that I wanted to emphasize, one moment, I'm just going to refresh this clicker to see if that helps it. Yes, that is helping a lot. Okay, fabulous. Sorry, my slides are jumping around. I will go back and then we'll be good, I think. Okay, perfect. So for this is the definition of the public humanities, but also that idea about defining the humanities is really important. So the humanities study the things that humans make: our art, writing, thoughts, religions, governments, histories, technologies, and societies. And the humanities help us to understand who we are, what we do, and why, as well as for what purpose that we're doing these things. So this impacts people at different scales. For individuals, this study of the humanities gives us tools for living a meaningful life, meeting a basic human need to understand the things that bring us joy and bring us sorrow. And for societies, the humanities are a mechanism for progress, the means by which our pursuit of justice is informed by our pursuit of truth. Therefore, humanistic inquiry occurs in all societies, which in turn establish educational institutions to house the humanities. So this inquiry comes first, and then we have these educational institutions to house them. One of the earliest examples would be Plato's Academy in Greece, which was established in 387 BCE. I'm sorry, I'm having some issues with the slides jumping around here. Apologies. There we go. Then there's the Library of Alexander, which was established in 331 BCE. We have the Imperial University in China, 141 BCE, and the University of Al-Qarim in Morocco. Here's the University of Bologna coming in as a relative latecomer in 1088, as well as the Autonomous University of San Domenico in the Dominican Republic in 1538. So we begin to see this structure of the academic humanities to this process of humanistic inquiry. There's a public endeavour that's happening organically, but then there's houses that come in place to develop them, to grow them, to cherish and nurture them. And of course, with that, there are problems inherent to institutions as well. That said, the humanities frequently surface in life beyond academia. Paul's letters and the Quran are sacred texts that began as humanities scholarship. Confucianism became state ideology in the Han Dynasty. The philosopher Karl Marx inspired the politics of communism. Thomas Clarkson's graduate school paper, an essay on the slavery and commerce of the human species, particularly the African, contributed to the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women was cited by the suffragettes. And Eric Williams' research on the economics of Britain's Slavery Abolition Act in 1833 informed his service as the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. Perfect, we're up to date. Yes, there's the anti-colonial psychologist Frantz Fanon, who inspired the revolutionaries of Malcolm X and Che Guevara, to Ali Shariati and Steve Biko, and intersectionality shifted from Kimberly Crenshaw's legal term in academic journals to an activist practice. She wrote and continues to speak out loud, "My feminism will be intersectional or it will be bullshit." So these are all examples of the public humanities happening beyond academia. Indeed, we see it with Judith Butler's notion of gender as performance, which anticipated the rise of sharing pronouns as a widespread social practice. On that note, I use the pronouns she and her. There's also influential youth activists such as Malala Yousafzai, Greta Thunberg, and the survivors of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, who have drawn upon their secondary curriculums in order to enact humanities in the world. So I think what's important here to emphasize is that the public humanities is evident in its impact on individuals, but also on communities, on societies and industries. And there are many ways to represent this value in terms of its historical value, social value, economic, experiential value. And I think that this diversity is one of the qualities that makes it particularly difficult to define. I will try and give a few examples. These are attempts to be representative, but certainly by no means a coverage of the humanities in its full breadth and impact. In the 1940s and the 1960s, for example, leading agitators for African independence held humanities degrees and read them. This included Leopold Sedar Senghor, Aimé Césaire, Ade Adaji, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, as well as Wole Soyinka. It's worth noting that 97% of Australians aged 15 and above engaged with the arts in 2022. And last year in America, 84% of Americans said that history education is just as important as business and engineering. The Acropolis in Athens is so popular that it recently had to cap visitor numbers at 20,000 people a day. I was lucky to visit in the pouring rain and did not find it to be this busy that day. There's also leading CEOs that often, again, have humanities degrees and enact humanistic practice of them in their work life. For example, we have Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba, Susan Wojcicki, who is the outgoing CEO of YouTube, and Michael Eisner of the Walt Disney Company, all have humanities degrees. There's also 150 countries around the world who have unanimously recognised culture as a public good. This was a result of the UNESCO World Conference in 2022 as well. It contributes to the economy in many ways, of course, but 50 million jobs in the creative industries is not something to underemphasise. It generates annual revenues worldwide of over $2 trillion. And lastly, psychologists have shown empirically that engaging with the humanities makes people happier. So I think that these kind of examples, this broad span, was to really underline that point, which we began with really in terms of maybe a reaction against this crisis in the humanities. We often see news coverage about the disciplines of the humanities framed in these terms of crisis: declining student enrollments, decreased funding, shuttered departments. And I think whilst this is absolutely the case within the academic humanities, these are a crisis constrained to professional fields operating out of colleges and universities. And Def and I, in our paper, we talk about the public humanities as a field both inside and outside of universities. And in life, it's thriving. We're having far more conversations about culture on the internet, when we're in social environments, on television, with our friends. These public humanities are absolutely thriving. So what about the public humanities as we know it in academia? That if we step into this smaller kind of contextual definition, the public humanities is rooted in the United States and the higher education systems associated with it. Its earliest mentions as a term come from funding bodies itself around the National Endowment for the Humanities, which was established after the Second World War in 1965. And from this time on, we see the emergence of the term through physical institutions and centres. So the founding of the National Humanities Centre, for example, in 1978, cites this as an example. There's public humanities graduate programs that proliferate, particularly in the 2000s. We've heard about Georgetown's MA in the introductory remarks. There's also John Nichols Brown Centre for Public Humanities and the Cultural Heritage at Brown University, which was one of the earliest centres founded in 2002. So in this genealogy that of the term public humanities, paradoxically, it is an academic endeavour, not associated much with the public at all. It's worth mentioning, I think, as well, that this sort of presence of public humanities continues to some extent to this present moment. There is currently more scholarship, more physical sites dedicated to public humanities work based out of North America than anywhere else in the world. There are programs that are emerging and in planning. I know there are colleagues, for example, in Hong Kong working to develop a public humanities program, and I wish them every success in that as it goes forward into its first iterations. But I think it's also worth emphasising that despite this North American tradition, public humanities work extends beyond a single continent and often reaches much further than when we formally recognise it as being public humanities work. There's other language we might use to describe this that you might have heard in other contexts. For example, citizen science, community engagement, cultural preservation, and social justice advocacy. And I think that this pluralism of vocabulary, this internationalism of practice, is something that I really want to talk about more when I get to the second part of my talk and when I discuss setting up the journal of public humanities. For now, in terms of this definitional work, I wanted to turn to talk about institutional critiques. So this institutional form of the public humanities within academia is open, I think, to 4 critiques as a practice in itself. The first of which is the top-down gifting of knowledge from an educated elite to a perceived unlearned public. And I think it's an inheritance that we have here around knowledge and who has the authority to speak on it, which we see kind of as a lineage from the 19th century and from Victorian education systems. There's also, of course, the North Americanness of the field, which I've previously discussed. And I think that this limits the purpose of public humanities in several ways. One, it limits our understanding of it in different contexts, which is really important. But also, I think it somehow also simultaneously challenges less resolutely academic forms of the public humanities that already exist in quite deep and sustained ways around the world. It owns a language, it owns a set of practices for itself, and it limits the possibility within that. I think it's also, in its most heavily institutionalized form, something that can sometimes, as a practice in the field, the public humanities can be more oriented actually towards serving the needs of academics than any of those publics it claims to affect. And this, I think, is perhaps the hardest and most important critique that we should dig into here in this school about that idea of service, accountability, and purpose. And the other thing that's the final critique I really wanted to emphasize here is that not all public humanities is good or good public humanities work. The idea of interacting in society does not guarantee you, moral or ethical certainty by any means. I think on this last point, it's worth citing that Hitler cited Nietzsche, and that state propaganda can be public humanities, and that the culture wars are also public humanities. So the main takeaway from this first part of my presentation that I wanted us to consider then is that public humanities is not the answer to all of our problems in academia, in the world at all. In fact, it's the site of the struggle. And it's very interesting to have an ability to talk about this in more material terms. That said, I think also it's another continual definition and return then that actually many of the best instances that if I was to point at and say, this is public humanities work in action, for example, such as the 1619 project, they don't actually call themselves public humanities projects. Just to give you a bit of information about 1619, I recommend you kind of engage in that and have a look at this yourselves. But it's a collaboration with a New York Times journalist, Nicole Hannah-Jones, and academic historians, where they addressed an issue of urgent social concern in the United States by bringing scholarship from the margins of academia to the center of mass media. They were historicising the role of slavery in the foundation of the nation of the United States. And the project upended the too simple myth of America's founding fathers as upright patriots resisting the evils of imperialism. Quoting the Declaration of Independence and the clause at the centre of America's identity, they said that all men are created, the quote from the Declaration of Independence is that all men are created equal. Jones observed that the white men who drafted those words did not believe them to be true for the hundreds and thousands of black people in their midst. So subsequent articles on the 1619 project are informed by rigorous scholarship, but they were written for a wide readership. And by seeking and actively seizing the reins of power in public communication, the 1619 project sparked a national debate about the legacies of slavery. It inspired curricular reform in educational institutions, and it also inaugurated a culture war in America. These are all forms of public humanities work that were instigated by this project. Public humanities is also happening when the linguist Bolanle Elizabeth Arokoyo created the first ever dictionaries for endangered languages in Nigeria, protecting Olukumi and Owe from fading out of use. It's also happening when the European Group Arches, which stands for the Accessible Resources for Cultural Heritage Ecosystems, uses technology to make museums more accessible to people with disabilities. It happens when public humanities happens and centres the authority of Indigenous scholars and embraces Indigenous intellectual practices to preserve our natural world. Public humanities improves crisis responses, it betters healthcare outcomes, and challenges migration policy. One key distinction I think that's useful in all of this is that there's a continual movement between doing and between thinking, between practice and theory. And I think this creates two different paradoxes for the public humanities. First, it is entirely possible, even frequent, for people who don't know, don't care about the term public humanities to do things that can aptly be described as being public humanities. So that's the first paradox there. People are doing it and they don't even know or care to know. And then second, I think that most of the thinking about public humanities, that theorising of the field, that mapping, conceptualising, understanding, is done in an academic setting that is not itself public at all. So again, a tension there between thinking and doing. Also, it's worth emphasising that despite strong motivations for individuals, for organisations to pursue the public humanities, significant barriers exist. There's fear of the unknown, fear of risk that causes established and senior scholars to remain within cosy academic enclaves. Junior academics stick to their peer-reviewed journals on the plan for tenure or for a permanent academic job. They write, by academics, for academics, because that's what counts in these systems of value for careers. It's what counts for promotion. Going public, of course, risks other things as well as reputational or career progression. Going public risks harassment. It risks abuse, especially for women, for queer scholars, for scholars of colour. Organisations don't want to risk that institutional reputation that comes with interacting with live and perhaps difficult social issues. And elsewhere, the public humanities is something that becomes cliquey, perhaps gated and protected and closed off indeed to all outsiders. So look, these are the kind of barriers that we're facing as a field, as people seeking to engage in a field. So what's next? I think that individuals, if we want to engage in the public humanities, we need to learn skills and strategies of mass media. There is that need, I think, to be able to communicate in different styles and registers, to interpret, to translate, as has already been mentioned. For institutions, we need to restructure academia's reward system. It's no good if the work that's done in the public humanities is not valued or is not valued equally to the work of colleagues working in other forms of academic work and endeavour. And finally, societies we need funding that's codified in government budgets. There needs to be national support and infrastructure for growing this thing beyond individual case studies. And I think with this 3-tier strategy, public humanities promises a future where knowledge about human creativity and culture is more available to more people in more places at different ages and stages of life, where the field itself is more representative of the different regions, of different disciplines, of different historical periods, professions, and perspectives of our world. and where public humanities is more thoroughly researched and it's better analysed, better understood, held to higher standards, more widely practiced, better funded, and hopefully more concretely impactful in society. So this brings both us as individuals, but also institutions and nations to better understandings of themselves, the things that they've made, but also what they want to make next. And if you're interested in these ideas that I've been talking about in the first half of this talk, I want to kind of flag this paper that's been mentioned. You can find it here online as a published version. I think that I wanted to start by setting out these definitions, perhaps in the expected register of a keynote, of an inaugural moment for Winter School, to give us some things to pin our ideas to, as a set of definitions, but also as a set of provocations. I also want to put forward an argument that the growth of participation in research communities like this can be partially understood as a humanities response to the pressures that we face in higher education at this very moment. Public humanities offers us the ability to create alternative models for thinking through current impact isomorphism, that blending of roles that we see creeping between universities, government policy, commercial arenas, that idea of the spread of these similar practices perhaps damaging and infringing upon the value of academic work in and of itself. Speaking from a national context, in the UK, academics are increasingly required to represent our work in societally impactful ways, whether that is something we wish to do or not. We see that in formal ways, of course, through things like the Research Excellence Framework, the REF, but there's also new work patterns that we see, new wings of the university, new departments, the language of business and engagement, policy and evidence making. These are all signs of this kind of conflation, this isomorphism between universities, government and business. So I think it's interesting, perhaps as a kind of meta-analysis, that we could certainly see the rise of interest in the public humanities by academics as somewhat of an inevitable intervention. Certainly Google's Ngram word count, which measures the word frequency of books, and nothing more, but it's certainly a kind of a crude measure. We see this rapid spike in the use of public humanities in the 2010s, which I think is not so coincidentally aligned and responding to the financial crash that we see worldwide in 2009. Given the widespread practices of marketization in higher education, the expansion and proliferation of evaluation criteria, there is this increased pressure to demonstrate what makes research valuable in public life. However, I want to underline that the public humanities shouldn't be understood only as this reactive phenomenon in the UK. It's also a form of resistance to that seemingly Thatcherite neoliberal mantra that there is no alternative. There is no alternative but to accept the limited evaluation criteria that we have around public accountability. So this challenges that. Instead, I think that the public humanities enacts a culture of research that extends beyond those areas. It gives us a bit more to work with as people living through this experience within higher education. I want to include here a quote from Jonathan Bate, who has significantly theorised value in higher education. And I'm going to read it out in full because I think it's really useful for us here today. He says, "The government and its officers have a prime duty to account for the expenditure of taxpayers' money. But in measuring the value of research, a much subtler style of accountancy is required. There is something especially inappropriate about the attempt to quantify the value and impact of work in the humanities in economic terms, since the very nature of the humanities is to address the messy, debatable, and unquantifiable, but essentially human dimensions of life, such as history, beauty, imagination, faith, truth, goodness, justice, and freedom." So Bates' definition here, I think it resists that limited means evaluation and rejects the notion of public good as a merely for-profit endeavour. And speaking here, more than a decade later, in the wake of a second significant financial recession in 2018 and 19, then a global pandemic. And I think in that context, those pressures on public accountability are only more acute. But what's important, though, in that context is how the humanities act and what we do. The emerging field of researchers and practitioners in the public humanities emphasise academic public relationships, which don't frame the university as this site of extraction, of being under threat, of potential violation, but instead as a partner within a community of other people, other publics, and other institutions. And this is why, in the second half of my talk, which I turn to now, I'm going to define public humanities as a process rather than as a distinct object, a distinct discipline. It is the process of research where meaning and value is created. So the theorist Matthew Fry Jacobson, he frames this pretty nicely when he says, the public humanities, properly conducted, is a verb, not a noun. Queenie Zuccardia concurs, as do I, with this definition. She writes, the public humanities are less of a noun and more of a verb, questioning, reflecting, deconstructing, reconstructing, retreating, seeding, and most of all, becoming. So this is this kind of endless process, this verbs, this doing, this action. And I think to identify or define the public humanities in this way naturally indicates action, which frames that idea as a defining trait of what it's about. As well as these verbs that Zuccardia includes, I would add coordinating, convening, facilitating, visualizing, advocating, writing. These are all examples of doing work in the humanities and in the public humanities. You might be sitting there wondering, why does that matter so much? Why does that distinction matter at all? And I think it matters because it draws attention to how and where public humanities work is creating knowledge and public value. By placing an emphasis on those interactive dynamics of the public humanities, we can reframe some of those more negative connotations of competitive or overlapping professional identities, of neoliberal complicity in impact schemes and policies, with more collaborative and active frames of reference. Therefore, rather than just accepting the economised limits around impact in or of higher education, the public humanities is working to stretch, to expand who and what knowledge is useful for and in what ways. And whether or not this fieldification that we're seeing at the moment will fortify or dilute that non-economic, that community-oriented and processual ambition of the public humanities truly remains to be seen. But for now, I'm going to try and kind of enact that and show and talk a bit more about this project that I've been doing in the public humanities, a public humanities process, which I've been working on since 2021, and in many ways, a lot longer than that. So the journal, we've heard it mentioned, but we're going to turn to that now. So if I've addressed what is public humanities in the first half, now we get to what is public humanities italicized as a publication. So the journal, it's a space for scholars, for students, for activists, journalists, policymakers, professionals, practitioners and non-specialists to connect, to share knowledge. It's a space for this activity to happen in. It asks big questions. We wanted it to have bold answers that combine both rigorously peer-reviewed research and accessible writing. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that process over the next few minutes. We have a mission which we share at the beginning of all of our meetings, which is that it's to create a venue for sharing knowledge about the intersections of humanities scholarship and public life. Okay, this is a bit hokey, but we really like having that sense of mission values because it's an important thing when you're defining and emerging a field. It helps with us with goal setting, decision making, and also to keep ourselves accountable to the main aim. There's two rationale that we sort of were interested in setting up the journal. First of all, a service to society. We recognised that there is a social need for humanities knowledge to be freely available in public life. It connects and speaks to many different areas of public life, of course, which includes sectors such as education, health, law and justice, civil rights, care, conflict, democracy, and the environment. So that's the first rationale, is that there's just an urgent need to make sure that people have access to the knowledge that the humanities is able to create. Then there's service to the profession, and we wanted to build a central meeting place for a diverse set of professions, also of different disciplines. We've spoken briefly in the graduate school's introductions about interdisciplinarity, but there's also the idea of multidisciplinarity, where people are speaking from deep disciplinary points of reference, but to each other around the same issues. We saw our success as a journal to be measured by how many connections we can create among previously disparate people and ideas. So there's that secondary academic need there, which I think also speaks to that consolidation of the public humanities as a means to survive within, but also to react against cuts to the humanities and the associated accountability of academic research in limited means. So what's it like building a journal? I want to tell a kind of narrative, a process which actually starts with somebody else's story. So I'm going to start with my co-collaborator, Jeff Wilson. He is my co-editor-in-chief. He's a fantastic thought partner and a humanities collaborator. Jeff, he comes from the world of Shakespeare studies. And in that field, he reliably informs me that there's a tension between historicism and presentism, studying the way that things were, but also with how Shakespearean texts surface in society today. He was working on this for a long period of time, and come 2019, he wrote an article in the MLA journal Profession called Historicising Presentism towards the creation of a journal in the public humanities. And at the end of the article, argued that we ought to have a space to talk about these things further, that a journal for the public humanities is a good thing to do, and that wealthy institutions ought to be the ones to pay for it. At that point, there was a Cambridge University Press got in touch with Jeff. There's a colleague, Holly O'Neill, who's very important in the story of public humanities, who got in touch with Jeff. And like all good academic ideas and how they start, they had a coffee on Jeff's campus, and they shared many values, many visions together. And then they left and went back to their respective homes. Months then turned into years. The conversation fizzled out. The enthusiasm they shared and the passions were just so hard to see how practically they'd be able to make this into a journal. Then there's my story into this. So across the Atlantic Ocean in the UK, I'd set my mind on journalism. I led the student newspaper as an undergraduate, and then interned at a few major newspapers and magazines before deciding, with not some small amount of frustration, that I needed a longer lead time for research, and that my idea for communication needed more evidence than the newspapers required. So I became a scholar of value. Interested in how knowledge is articulated and how value is measured, especially around culture and the humanities. My book, Value in the Humanities, is open access, and it talks about the challenges of neoliberalism. After finishing it, I thought, okay, this is great. We've got an account of how things are and perhaps why, but what are we actually going to do about it? And I think I found the idea and concepts emerging in the public humanities as a kind of antidote to the depressing disorientation, to use Amster's phrase, of studying neoliberalism for this long. I also connected with Holly at Cambridge University Press through work that I've been doing around evidence for the humanities, and we met, as all great collaborations during the early 2020s did, on Zoom, and we began to have conversations with Jeff. You can also see another colleague there, Professor Sarah Dillon from Cambridge University, who I've worked with more extensively prior to this around evidence, and we spoke about the way in which maybe the journal could cross national contexts and act as a vehicle for shaking up the dynamics of public humanities as a North American phenomenon. Many meetings over the next 2.5 years took place, but there's this commitment to that mission that kept us going. And these were the things that we were most passionate about doing. We wanted the journal to be open access, and we wanted it to be a space where it was high quality research that was being accessed. We really wanted it to be speedy in delivery so that people could have a satisfying research trajectory beyond long scale publishing timelines. And finally, we needed it to be financially sustainable. We didn't want this to be a single flash in the pan moment, but rather a space for years to come that people could write for. It's worth saying that being all four of those at once was almost impossible, because being already one of those four things in the humanities is actually quite difficult to manage. So I'm going to talk through these challenges to add some specificity to that experience and that process. The first being open access. So the main challenge was about the funding models available. Unlike the sciences, where research is often, and the publication of research is often covered by grants who are for the authors who are writing in journals, the humanities research is not grant funded in this way. Individual researchers cannot, and I argue ethically should not, pay for the cost of publishing their research. For anyone who's tried to engage with the more predatory side of open access publishing, you'll know that there is a phenomenon called article processing charges, which authors or organizations are required to pay in order to publish. And so we wanted to avoid that cost and that burden being placed on individuals, and we wanted there to be no part in that. There's also, I think, disciplinary publishing norms and incentivization. So traditionally, or perhaps up until the last 5 years, humanities scholars have often published with journals that actually explicitly don't have open access options. It's not because of there's kind of multiple factors here. One, that they haven't been as ubiquitous, they haven't been as available. So the kind of best established journals are indeed traditional kind of text-based or print-based journals. But there's also, I think, an enduring sense of those journals being more prestigious as a result. They've been longer running, they have deeper histories, and are recognised perhaps as being a higher value of research than those of open access. And I think that's something we're trying to challenge in the journal, in terms of open research and available research not being as prestigious. Then there's the idea of peer review. So, academics, we use journalism outlets that engage with research in the public domain. So I can imagine many of us have engaged with the press in terms of our careers, or might think about talking to someone. And I think that there is this layer of interpretation that we get. And I'm not saying it's not a good thing. It's absolutely brilliant to have journalism about the humanities. But there is this need perhaps for a hook or an angle of a news media or a story that isn't suited for all research that is of public importance. Academic expertise really matters, and in different ways. And we wanted to make a public place that demonstrated this. We also wanted it to be speedy in delivery. The slowness of the publishing process in academic research cannot be understated, I think, in some ways, especially with the elements where we want to be able to intervene with ongoing conversations of things that are happening, to offer a response in a timely way, to be useful. There's a real challenge there in terms of how we could do this, in terms of having humanities voices speaking to what's happening now. And then lastly, the financial sustainability thing. We wanted, we recognise that the scholarly publishing landscape is transforming, and it's transforming for a number of reasons, predominantly the shift to digital, but also, with the rise of different forms of publication models and access. So we wanted a model that recognised the labour that's involved in producing work for the journal. We weren't comfortable with the idea of asking people to edit and work for free on something that would be a for-profit benefit for the press. So this was something that we kind of worked through a lot with the journal, and I'll speak more about in a minute. And actually this financial thing was perhaps the most difficult part. The business model itself, it felt like mission impossible. There was a lot of trial and error. We first of all sought institutional support from the University of Cambridge. No luck there. We considered going out to find some sort of angel donor with a passion for the humanities. Maybe we could find someone to fund us in that way. At one point, Jeff and Sarah and I were creating a $500,000 budget and funding proposal, and then we were all like, we're humanities scholars, what are we doing? And I think it was working with Cambridge in such a kind of sustained way that we were able to work through this, and really testament to their long-standing expertise in publishing works. The breakthrough came through this idea of transformative agreements. So this means that we are able to make the claim and enact the fact that all authors can publish in the journal at no cost to them, ensuring every author can publish and enjoy the benefits of open access, regardless of their funding model and background. It wasn't easy to get to. I can talk more about this if people are interested in, but it's, it required a lot of creativity, of consideration, and complementary schemes. The system that we have in place is quite complicated, but it does mean that everybody is covered. We wanted to work with Cambridge partly because of this expertise. We thought that it would be really important also for long-term resourcing. As I said, we could have applied for funding for this to be a short project with a 2 to 3 year time span, but we wanted this to be a far more enduring kind of prospect. We wanted also to have archives that published into perpetuity. One of the challenges, I think, of public humanities work is that it happens, it's brilliant, and then we forget. We aren't able to share and connect. And so that was another kind of main reason that we valued Cambridge as a publisher. We also wanted to get right into the heart of university publishing, to say that publicly engaged research is essential and fundamental and right at the heart of kind of prestigious publishing culture. It's certainly a internationally recognised place to publish high quality research. I think I would expect many of you to have heard of it as a press prior to today. And I think that allows for early career researchers in particular to do public humanities work with the acknowledgement that some of these more traditional markers of success are also being met. There's work there then, I think, in terms of getting involved in the mainstream, contributing to the idea of the canon, but also perhaps to encourage people who maybe haven't identified themselves as public humanities scholars to be aware of the field, to say, hey, maybe I could adapt and write in this style, and I could contribute to this community. It's also worth emphasising, I think, that they have deep resources. This isn't, meant only as a financial thing, but actually in terms of the people and the team. And one thing that's really stood out to me, certainly in the first year of making this journal happen, is their amazing creative talent, particularly their marketing team, who've done an amazing job of working with us to develop visuals and templates that go and bring the journal to life in ways that I think are really pushing the traditional bounds of academic work. They've also got, with that resource, better infrastructure for accessibility. They're supporting new platforms for new ways of engaging with research beyond just text-based engagement. And they also offer us legal support. So this is, I think, really important in terms of addressing live social issues and mitigating some of those risks I spoke about in the first half of this paper around what happens when you speak out in public life. We have some great support there around ethics and legal, which is really appreciated and valued. Okay, so a few more nuts and bolts details. I hope you're enjoying getting all the goss on the launch of the journal. There is this process of developing a journal. We meet, we chat, we say we should do this, we find a model that works. Then we start collaborating on convincing the board at Cambridge University Press. They're called the syndicate, which I think is a very sort of ominous word. We draft up a proposal and we begin to flesh out the intellectual qualities of the journal. We knew that the journal had to represent different regions, different disciplines, different periods, different perspectives, but we also wanted a big community of people to convey that fullness and diversity. We didn't want one person to have to be a spokesperson for an entire discipline. So we settled on a structure of editors, a board of editors who are more involved decision makers, and there's 10 of us in total, and then an advisory board which is far wider, which are more enthusiastic community members who have less of a time commitment in the journal. And we start reaching out and gathering together a group of people. I'm delighted to kind of introduce the editors that we have on board at the moment. So we have Ananya Jahanara Kabir, who works in interdisciplinary humanities work. She connects text to non-textual cultural production, and she works in dance and music across the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds. Then there's Julia Kint of the University of Sydney. She's a professor of classics and ancient history, but she's also an expert in religion, human, non-human interactions in the ancient world. Sarah Nuttall, the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. She's just finished a decade-long tenure as the director of the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, and she's published widely on post-apartheid South Africa and the disciplinary background there coming from literary, cultural, urban theories and aesthetics. Kobina Opoku Anyamang is working at the University of Ghana. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me sharing that his mother has just been elected as the first ever female vice president of Ghana. So that's a very exciting time for him and his family. Congratulations. But he's an expert in digital culture, post-colonial studies, and the director of the School for International Training in Ghana. We've also got Ricardo Ortiz, who's at Georgetown, one of those established programs for the public humanities, professor in Latinx literatures. Manuela Peak, who's an expert in gender and sexuality and political science. Last year, she coordinated the presidential campaign of the indigenous water defender Yaku Perez Guatambel in Ecuador. Mary Rambaranaum is an independent scholar specialising in early medieval England and race. And Neil Williams of the University of Roehampton now, he's just moved, is a moral philosopher specialising in the environmental humanities. So these are the people we got on board to represent some of the cross-humanities disciplines. And then we put together an advisory board, 92 scholars from across 6 continents. We began then to institute a call for papers, a manifesto issue, which, as you heard, just published 2 days ago. It was inviting bold ideas, big provocations for the public humanities as a field and practices. What we weren't expecting was from a single page on a website to receive 110 submissions, which I think showed real momentum for the project. We met and we decided, okay, we're going to do a manifesto, but we also see so much work here that we want to develop into different forms that don't fit with a manifesto. So we've commissioned 4 other issues along those lines, which you'll see on the slides here, some of that beautiful design work the marketing team have done as well. There's historical public humanities, looking at the way in which the term has happened and predates the rise of the term. It looks at King Alfred, the medieval era, Edward Said, and public intellectualism. The how-to issue will look in a much more practical way at how to actually learn skills and engage with collaborative learning. We're sharing a practical guide for doing the public humanities. Public humanities in action is case studies, research-backed, presenting trials, errors, unforeseen challenges and adversities, a resource surely for anyone wanting to do public humanities work in the future. Across the disciplines, there's a more theoretical issue. We've invited different disciplines to lay out their stall, to present their understandings of and approaches to the public humanities, and to reflect on the value of their subject areas to the public interest. So papers start rolling in and we kick off peer review, which has specific criteria about ensuring brilliant research as well as accessibility in written communication. And we were so thrilled to start publishing back in November. It felt like a massive milestone, I think, in terms to be public as public humanities. And I'm just going to use those very closing minutes to just give you a tour of the journal and what we've done so far and what we have up ahead. So we've got 2 main branches of the journal. There's an of the moment section, which is for short articles for wide audiences. It's open for submissions and any of you are absolutely welcome to contribute to this. We want articles that show the work of the humanities at work in public life. They might offer new readings of old texts. They might engage with specific current events, social life, politics, public holidays. They could profile particular public humanities practitioners who are illustrating the societal value of the humanities. Maybe you've got an empirical report that's conveying data about the humanities in public life, or you've written a policy brief that you want to share. We are kind of open to all of the above and many more things in this section. It's an open call for individual contributions to the public humanities. For example, then we've published Emily King writing about museums and the video game Animal Crossing, New Horizons. We've got Cyan Day theorising the saffronization of public knowledge in India. And as Isabel Vera Gregory, she's written about the invisibility of Sudan's civil war from the perspective of an archaeologist. The second arm of the journal is the themed issues. So these are thematically curated and guest edited by members of the humanities community. The manifesto issue, it features, for example, articles like Jonathan Bates teaching the humanities for the public, Rupika Rassam's Public Humanities Before Public Humanities, and Manuela Peake's Scholar Activism When Our Bodies Stand by Our Ideas. So those two branches of the journal, the of the moment section and the themed issues, help us structure this wager that we're making. We think that the public humanities can be both a space for thinking and for doing, for thinking about what the public humanities is, reflecting on the field among scholars. So, for example, some thinking pieces I think would be Christopher Newfield's piece that's looking at funding in the United States, or Gaia Sims looking at building public humanities programming on a former plantation. But then there's also those who are doing public humanities practices. Maybe they're writing in accessible ways for wide audiences, like Carol Atack does in her piece on democracy, ancient and modern, really relevant, I think, in terms of the events of the last month. Diego Mantoan also does this when he tracks the female gaze from 1990s visual arts to today's pop culture in perhaps our best named article so far about licking milk cans. But I think that these are two kind of dimensions, two oscillations in the journal that we're working between. Looking at our readership and total page visits since we started, there's some early, but I think key indicators of engagement that we're hoping to, sustain and develop. Our largest readerships, unsurprisingly, are in the United States, but there are, in terms of the accumulation of our top 10 readerships, coverage across Europe, across Asia, and Australasia, which is promising to see. We hope to kind of consolidate and expand that reach of the public humanities beyond North American contexts. Yeah, that's that graph there. Okay, I also just wanted to give you a quick tour of some of the themed issues that are coming up to show you these depths of conversations and the constellations that are coming. Many of these are actually still open for call for papers, so feel free, if these fall within your research area, to get in touch with the guest editors for this. We have Indigenous Public Humanities, edited by Manuela Peake. We've got an issue on Creole gardens as a decolonial practice, regrowth, resistance, recycling, repair. That's edited by Ananya Kabir and Rosa Bunel-Fogarty. An issue on global public literary humanities by Tim Lazendorfer and Pavan Malreddy. Literature and Science in the Public Sphere, edited by John Holmes, Jenny Halpin and Aura Heidenreich. We have Palestine as Paradigm, looking at how Gaza transformed the world, just edited by Iman Abdelhadi. We have Public Political Philosophy, edited by philosophers George Boss and Jonathan Floyd. An issue looking at science and the humanities through just transitions, looking at antimicrobial resistance, edited by Sheila Varadan, Miriam Waltz, Sarah DeWitt, and Klaus Kirschel. An issue on the elusive rise of the far right, a transnational perspective, which is going to be edited by Jonathan Obert and Adi Gordon. So there's a real range of different topics and disciplines represented there. This is a quick preview of some issues that we've recently commissioned and are looking forward to kind of representing in the journal as well. An issue celebrating the centennial of the Harlem Renaissance this year. An issue on the rights of nature, based out of Latin America, looking at local knowledge for global solutions. An issue based from Mauritius, looking at dialogues around the blue humanities and oceans. We've also got some archaeologists looking at the world beyond the trowel. So hopefully you're sitting here feeling inspired to get involved, and I really hope you will. You can do this in a variety of ways. You can write for the journal in terms of the of the moment if you've got something immediately you want to say. You could propose a themed issue if you're working in a network or know people who might want to get together and do a thing around a more consolidated theme. Maybe you just think there's a gap in our journal and you want to suggest what we should go out and look at and commission. You can suggest the topic too without doing any more work. So that's the story so far. It's the process of making public humanities. One way I hear my co-editor Jeff talk about this is it being like a rendezvous. We intend it to be a meeting place for a diverse set of professions, of people. I think sometimes academia can feel like there's a lot of barriers, a lot of boundaries between disciplines, maybe behind paywalls that no one can afford, clubs and cliques. And this journal is meant to be a big tent. We're working really hard to make sure that the plural practices, perspectives, and epistemologies are included. And this is a quality I hope we can see in this winter school as well, as we confer and we converse and we agree and disagree about the uses and values of this emerging concept. So thank you very much for listening, and I really look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Zoe, for this wonderful talk. I think there are a lot of ideas, and you show in how many ways it's possible to do the public humanities, which are the challenges too. I was very interested on how you open the process, not just the result of a journal, but the process, which is very often the place where, I mean, things get really tough and messy. So, and many of us just give up at that moment. So it's wonderful to got to the end of the process, and now you are publishing this wonderful journal. So we have half an hour for discussion. Please, raise your hand. There are some microphones going around.
First of all, thank you very much for the talk. I had two questions, and one of them you kind of answered during the presentation. One of them was, can public humanities stay alive without academic humanities? And you kind of hinted at it, that most of the theorizing is still done in the academic setting, so we still need to campaign for the preservation of humanities within universities, etc. So that's that. But the other question, and I guess it's a bit more problematic and difficult, and depending especially where in the world academic is located. I am a PhD student in theology, and I work on education and religion, etc. And sometimes those issues can be very problematic when, in Estonia, for example, when we said, well, we need religious education in schools, and people were very furious about it, that who brings religion into education. So my question is, when does this kind of public humanities stop, where there is this kind of claim for objectivity almost, that we're still being objective doing research, and where does the activism begins, when I know that something is right, I have empirical and theoretical research to prove it, and now I just need to force it upon decision makers or society, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I also acknowledge that it's slightly strange that I'm presenting remotely. So I feel like if anyone wants to respond or interject after I've spoken or speak back, please do talk to each other in the room as well. I'm happy to listen in. Thank you so much for those two questions. I think, to briefly comment on your first, can the public humanities survive without academic public humanities? I would say yes, I think it can. I think it, part of the talk I was sort of, outlining is it's happened without us, and it will continue to happen if we cease to exist, which I hope is absolutely not the case. But I do think there is some merit in delving into the qualities of an academic mind and an academic set of practices around it, to connect it, I guess, to things that happen within universities. I think that there is so much knowledge and expertise within different disciplinary areas that is not currently connected to that conversation. It would be a loss in that way. It's really interesting hearing you talk about your own discipline and theology and religion. I think I can completely empathize with how it's one of those areas where it's important to weigh up the ethical, moral balances between what and how we communicate things. I would say one thing we've been very aware of in setting up the journal is making space for different kinds of humanities scholarship and not becoming exclusively an activist journal. So we certainly feature the work of activists, and we have issues that I think are more politically activist oriented and are perhaps, as editorials, making claims that are editorial as well as objectively not true. But I think as a set of a constellation of research, we offer different modes of communication, and this is because we recognize, and part of that typology that I mapped out at the beginning is about the different ways in which people seek to intervene in public life. I think if you want to influence policy, for example, there is a appropriate register and means of communication that you might choose or choose not to engage in as a as a researcher, based on your own decision making about efficacy, about morals, about what you're willing to not compromise. And that's an individual choice of researchers. We've had a lot of conversations with the Cambridge University Press about making sure that people are not censored in the journal. Certainly we publish research, not opinions. These aren't people's thoughts and feelings, but they're backed up by academic scholarship. But I think that equally our values around truth, for example, and justice are ones that really do touch on people having different points of view, and part of studying the humanities is that we don't agree always as humans on the same things. And so it's a really pertinent question, but one where we're kind of trying to, at the moment at least, not exclude ourselves from conversations where the word activist alone would be so off-putting, but yet also protecting and preserving the right and space for people who do those forms of practice of public humanities to exist, to be represented and also supported. So that's my answer. I don't know if you've got any thoughts or follow-ups or clarifications, or if anyone else wants to chip in. That's great.
And where and then where?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm Terje Toomistu from University of Tartu. I'm a researcher and I'm also a documentary filmmaker. So I have some insight on both of the worlds. And what I feel as a junior researcher on non-tenure track yet, I feel that these academic jobs are very demanding, and in terms of teaching, research, supervisions, conference travels, all takes time, and I sometimes feel that I barely have time to read books recently. And then when I look at the world of documentary films, then when there are films that are intended to have a wide public reach or public impact, political impact, then there's the term called impact campaigns, which are often led by professionals, which often have distinct budgets, which means that this workload that goes into this impact campaign that a work such as a documentary film should have is very well planned and funded, ideally. So my question is, when we are as academics trying to have a public reach, then this work to have this public reach is also time consuming, and at the same time what still matters as an academic currency are the peer-reviewed journal articles. So how to balance this work, or maybe you could comment on that in general, but also maybe some examples in which university institutions how they have managed this issue. That yes, I feel that there is a demand to have a public reach in grant applications, or to think through at least how you are communicating your research results to the public. But at the same time, it's not really valued as part of this career planning when we still end up counting how many journal articles you have published, but not really counting how many interviews you gave in the media, or if you produced a documentary film on a side of your research, or if you produced an exhibition on a side of your research. This still seemed to be undervalued in career planning. Yeah. So I think it's a very critical question that many of us are thinking. Thank you.
It's like such an important question, and thank you so much for asking it as well. I think it's a hard one to address because I think partly I empathize so strongly with you, and that the work that I'm doing in this journal is perhaps that attempt to make it easier for people to share things in different formats. Just to give you an example, that we're currently working with a producer of graphic novels to have who is also an academic, to publish their not their graphic novel within the journal, which will, in the eyes of their institution, count finally as research, where their previous outputs have not been valued within frameworks, just because we have the designation of something like a DOI, which is a academic reference code that the systems will acknowledge. I think to respond to your point, I guess, about the way in which things are funded and structured, the presence, I think, of places for people who are doing the public humanities to share knowledge can make things a lot easier, I hope, in the future. I would say today a lot of work that's done around engagement is done at an individual or a community basis, and so part of this work about national and international networks is to assist people to see how it's been done before, so we're not all continuously reinventing the wheel, or perhaps having to learn only from our own mistakes rather than the mistakes we might have made, that we're happy to share in public with others. I guess, like, in terms of how you might align or be more, I would use the word sort of canny or operative within the systems of higher education to do this work, I wonder, in terms of finding that thing that really you want to do it for as a researcher. We, regardless of our topic, whether it's the most sort of desk-based archival project, I sincerely believe that we as researchers know that there is value in doing this work, right? There is value that is to be articulated, and finding a way, I guess, to connect that story. And this is where the art of communication, of public storytelling, of the ability to translate the meaning of what you're doing to others is so important. If you are able to communicate that, then I think that that's particularly effective. So I suppose perhaps one idea I have is some more training around that work of translation. And it's something that Jeff and I are trying to get some funding in place to do a series of workshops through public humanities about accessible writing and communication. And so you don't actually have to change the work you want to do, but just change your ability to talk about it and show the value that it has inherently to other audiences. I'm just interested in knowing, like, I don't know if I can throw it back to you, but about, is there a relationship between your documentary filmmaking and your research, or are they just two parts of your life that are both kind of equally important? Can I ask you that? I'm sorry to put you back on the spot.
In my work practice, my research and my documentaries have been related to each other, but they have been separate projects. And I feel that if my value as an academic, then this documentary work or the public impact work that I've done is not really counted. So my specific question was that, are there any universities which are which have done it better to also include the public work, the creative work as a accountable credit in academic career planning?
Yeah, absolutely. I get your question now. Yes, I think it's changing. Is it changing for good reasons? I'm not 100% sure. I'll be honest. For example, I can speak about my own university, which is the University of Birmingham. And they've recently set up a new track for academics who are doing this kind of socially engaged work predominantly or most of the time. And so that track is actually called EEI. So you might traditionally have had an academic research and teaching contract or a teaching contract, and now you can have a engagement, enterprise and impact career trajectory. And so I do indeed have a colleague who is a filmmaker who produces and directs films, who is on that track and has the work that's done around all of that work around filmmaking counted. So certainly, I think in the UK, there is a move towards recognition. You'll often hear it couched in that language of engagement or enterprise. And with that, there is, of course, the undertone always of it having economic or demonstrable value in numerical often terms. But certainly there is some shifts towards that. I don't know if other people have other examples they'd add to that, but I would say certainly there is a shift in the last 5 years towards some frameworks for that.
If I can jump in before the next question, sorry. I see also a bit the challenges of the process we are in, but you were mentioning with the idea that, we are going to consider and to value more and more this kind of outreach. Because what Tauri was saying about these projects funded, for instance, by ERA, or more recently by Chance, which is a great opportunity, of course, but what I see is that, well, there are the expectations on the knowledge exchange side are growing and growing, and these are on the other hand kind of become already a challenge to the scholarly side, so to academic side. So I happen to assess some of these reports from these projects, and it was, for me, it was a bit alarming to see how people are doing, policy briefing a couple of months after the project is started, but when after in the middle of a process that is 1.5 years, there are no publications or very few participation in academic conferences, so that this university, for instance, has started to value this kind of outreach in a quantitative way. So when you are assessed as a professor, if you have, I don't know, 4 outreach activities per year, then you are at this level. But if you have 8 or more, then you are on this level. So I think this is a very stupid way on how to assess this kind of, or value this kind of outreach that we produce. But yes, the questions.
Hi. Am I audible? Yeah. Thank you so much, Zoe. I can chip in a bit on the same previous point which was made, because for me, academia was kind of a place where I don't have to commercialize my work. That's how I joined in. And for me, artistic research as a field of interest was something which excited me. But when I found out that how disciplinarian ideas are being forced on that as well, so within an academic setting, there is so much of conflict to deal with. Like, we have all these words which are extremely disciplinarian, and then when you try to communicate that I'm not really wanting to deal with discipline or method here, or it's not something which you can put in a box, there's a lot of, I don't know, silence or a lot of confusion. And I think that is something which really kind of something which does not let me sleep, sort of thing, because why I'm doing artistic research is because I think that my practical work or my work of creation can be of some use. It can create knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily have to follow the traditional ideas of like publications and everything. And I do know certain institutes which I think have figured out those ways. Like, there is an Academia of Arts Vienna has a PhD in practice, where they really encourage that. You don't have to go to conferences to get credits. You work 4 years. And I think it's also a lot of thing is like a mutual trust. If someone is offering their time, they're not there to just not do anything. Like, these 4 years are as valuable for the researcher as it is for any other institute. So yeah, that would be one thing. My question, I think you did briefly answer, and you also pointed out on the disciplinarian nature of discipline, and like how public humanities is something which is of a verb. It's not something which you can like pinpoint at. But I'm curious, like, how do you, is there a framework in which you want to incorporate public mediums? Because for me, I got scholarship, like access to scholarship through YouTube, through like, there's a huge Patreon community of, I would say, researchers who are not kind of bounding that knowledge within peer-reviewed journals or XYZ, which has its own pitfalls, as I think we are all realizing with as the time is passing. So do you have any ideas around that, and how do you think that can be, like, again, how we can make accessibility more accessible to everyone? Thank you.
Thank you so much for those questions. They're absolutely brilliant questions, and I think yes, as somebody who has often been more interested in getting things done than sort of the divisions between us as disciplinarians, I can empathize with you there as well. And I think maybe just one caveat, I suppose, is to defend people perhaps a little bit on those grounds is about time. And I think, in an academic career, we've heard about this in the Q&A already, but having resource, having energy, having time and capacity to do what is currently within the current system seen as an addition of more than, it takes effort. And I don't want to kind of make it sound like this is easy and this is something that people should just be doing as part of their remit. I think it's something that if you can find the ways in which it really fuels you and energizes your research and work, then it can be immensely rewarding. But it's not without its own toll in some ways. The point about public mediums is a brilliant one, and it's a conversation we've had a lot actually about the journal in terms of different media formats in particular. You're absolutely right. I think that the rise of YouTube and the video essay as a kind of form of research communication is really important to think about. One factor I would add to that conversation would be around the ownership of platforms and the ways in which a lot of the media that we access are owned by private companies that are geared towards making a profit rather than perhaps preserving knowledge or intellectual value. So one thing I think about, for me when I'm thinking about video content is about how we host and preserve it. And this is it's quite a dry response to let's make some cool media. I'm like, but how will it be preserved and protected? And in fact, video files are incredibly difficult. And so the answer is not perfectly. But I would be wary, I guess, in terms of who and where this information sits. We've seen certainly, a large number of social media platforms change and cease to exist even in the last 10 years. And so I think I would be wary about that in terms of a reliable platform to share our research on. That said, I do think that we're looking at videos and in the integration of that in the journal. The Cassini platform that was mentioned is a platform that we're using to hold live talks and webinars and discussions that will run alongside, we hope, all of the themed issues in the journal, and provides that kind of slightly more engaging format than simply a PDF article. I think it would be really amazing also to have a podcast. And again, this circles back to my first answer, which was about time and resource. And we've spoken a lot about the idea of having different outputs and formats alongside it. And it comes up every meeting, and we talk about this. But I think it's something that, again, it takes time and resource. I think it's resource and time that's worth spending, and we will be doing that. I completely agree with you that if we're going to engage with publics, we need to be doing more than just writing in a engaging style. But yeah, watch this space. If you've got any good ideas, can you let us know? That would be amazing. Send me an email. We can have a go at making it happen. Thanks.
Other questions or remarks from here and then one there and one here. Yeah.
Yes, over here. Thank you for this presentation. I was just wondering about communicating value. I feel like there's a trap in it, the trap of usefulness. I don't know how much do you contend with this when communicating research to lay people, to the public, that there is this need to show a tangible, concrete value, a product, a benefit. Is there a way out of it? What do you think?
Thanks for that one. That's a good one. Yeah, I think there's a way out of it, I think it depends on who you're talking to, right? So I think if we're talking about people who are looking at the instrumental application of knowledge, then I'm not sure there is. I think in terms of engaging with certain policy arenas, perhaps certain people with time-sensitive, limited forms of understanding or use, yes, that's going to be the case that you need to change your register. I think also, though, that there is, and something we forget, is how much joy people find in culture, creative, humanistic knowledge. And that, my talk in the beginning, in that more theoretical half, where I was talking about the reasons that we study the humanities is also to understand what makes us human, the joy and sorrow of existence, I don't think that that's something that anyone would want to quantify. And so when you can actually remind people of that effect and profile that, it's really important. We lose the ability to articulate these things, but the more we do it, the more we say, this is something that makes me happy, and this is something that enriches my life and makes me feel connected and makes me feel good. These are feelings, really, but they're equally valid, I think. So I would say talking more to people about those emotional and affective reactions is important. I think also doing things that the value of them is fun is absolutely adequate. So yeah, I hope there's room.
We can take two questions. We were in the queue, and then that's all. And, but please be brief. Yeah.
Okay, Zoe, thank you. Sorry, is this turned on? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much for the talk. It's a real achievement to be able to communicate your enthusiasm through the barrier of Zoom, I must say. I admire you for doing that. I should own up to having been a member of that very sinister body that you mentioned, the Syndicate of Cambridge University Press. So I'm one of the mafiosi bosses involved in the backing of this project. I just want to raise one question, and interested in your answer, about whether the term humanities in your label is an advantage or disadvantage, really, for the project that you have in mind. I mean, as we know, humanities as a term only really gets established in the 20th century to refer to a group of academic disciplines, not the social sciences or the natural sciences. And it still, in most people's mind, overwhelmingly means that. Now, what you've talked about and given a great range of examples of are forms of engaged intellectual activity. Not in any recognizable sense, forms of what most people understand by the humanities. So when you cite, Mary Wollstonecraft and Karl Marx and so on, of course, by definition, they're engaged. They're not what most people would call doing the humanities. So for your project, is there a tension? Is there a difficulty? You want it to reach out in some way, but by using the term humanities, in many people's ideas, you're going to keep it as a way of referring to a group of purely academic disciplines.
Thank you for that question, Stefan, and also for revealing yourself as one of the syndicate. You are, in fact, the only person I know on the syndicate, as the rest remain mysterious to me. So lovely to meet one of them. Okay, yeah, I think that's really interesting and probably true. I think in terms of the correlation of different disciplines and the way in which it would be conceived, we've certainly got people who sit within the social sciences engaging with the journal. To answer it from the academic side first, people who are working in looking at population studies, urban studies, things like that. They are formally social scientists. Indeed, I think when we look at other bodies of research that look across the value of the humanities and social sciences, particularly in Europe, we see the two terms used together. So, there's ISH, which is the European Alliance for the Social Sciences, and humanities, and we see those things together. I think we wanted the journal to make space for, I guess, the disciplines that we felt like were the least represented in public discourse in general. And so partly it's about the kind of anti-narrative to the decline of the humanities. You don't often hear, in mass media, in political communications, the decline of the humanities and social sciences. So partly it's that positioning, I guess, in terms of a consolidation of something that may be under threat. But I do absolutely hear your point of it being a limit. I would have preferred we were called something far more interesting, and maybe in the future we can, once we built up an audience and a readership. We wanted at the moment for people to know that this is a space where they can contribute. There's no use in attracting readers to a journal where there isn't any stuff, and so partly it's a call to arms for people within the disciplines to put an effort into producing things, and then from there we can develop. I think you're right, though. I think if I was to sort of fall one way or the other, I would say yes, it's a limit. And I think that certainly when we look at the practice of knowledge and the things that are appearing in the journal, it's not only public humanities, but there's even some pure scientists in there, you know. But yeah, it's a really interesting question to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I have a question about what public humanities relationship is, or is there a wider discussion being held about digital humanities? Is it seen as an appendage? I sort of realized that it could be folded into the typologies, some of them seen at the beginning of the presentation. Specifically with regards to a point of contention I recently became aware of in some people being very heavily critical of it in terms of it being oriented around data amalgamation and archiving without, or with little regard to actual interpretation, even being folded into a wider movement in the University of Virginia towards the post-critical, or being like, well, you know, what that entails, even daringly being called the Silicon Valley of the humanities, which to me was impactful, since I read one of the main texts, which author escapes me, but it was an article called Hello Worlds, or Why Humanities Students Should Learn Computer Coding, which I found very very exciting. But then I read this other article being very fairly critical of it and thought, oh, shit. So is there a wider conversation being had about it? What are the thoughts on that point?
Yeah, fantastic question. Thank you. I think there should be more conversations being had than are. There are certainly some people who identify as digital public humanities scholars. You hear that kind of hybridization. I think that the use of the digital humanities to describe a kind of specific domain perhaps distinguishes it from the public humanities, as I've been arguing, as a process, as a kind of orientation towards knowledge. That said, I do think that these are intersecting things, and we see it actually with a number of other more established arenas of knowledge. So, for example, in North America, there's a great wealth of African American scholarship, Black studies, and we see that hybridization, for example, of Black public humanities as a combination of the practices that have long existed in that particular field, connecting with public humanities practices. So, I think it's neither should it be subsumed, or is it unrelated. I would say as well, just to your point about the kind of learning code, that certainly is a form of public communication, of transference. Maybe it's a case that some of these examples fall under that category of not all public humanities is good public humanities as well. Certainly there is that sense of data, and we see increasingly of the shift to large language processing tools and things like that condense and control information in ways that we're not fully up to speed with. We should be engaging with. But I think it's public humanities, right? Whether we like it or not, it's part of that conversation. Whether those scholars in those fields choose to think about it and consider it in those terms is another thing. I would encourage them to do so, though. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for being with us, at least virtually. Well, I think it was a wonderful way to opening the conference, or rich talk and discussion. So that I think that a lot of the topics that we discussed today will return in the conference. So we are very sad not to have you here for the next couple of days. But now, as ancient philosophers used to say, philosophy, and we can add maybe the humanities, actually grows out of uselessness. So just to refer to the questions there, what the Romans called otium. And one of the most pleasurable forms of otium is the convivium. And so that you are all invited to the lunch which is served here just around the corner in the hall, to continue our discussion, but also to enjoy the food.